Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I am the community coordinator with the Stewardship Network. And without further ado, let's get started. So first, a little bit about us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based member communities from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of each month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. We connect the specialized knowledge we've collected from and for our TSN member communities, and we share it as widely as possible. This webcast is a great example of that. We equip by removing hurdles for TSN member communities so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. And we mobilize through our TSN member communities. We make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all. So now I would like to tell you a little bit about a great Mobilize project that we have going on right now, the Stewardship Network Spring Challenge. So we kicked that off on April 10th of this year, and it will be going until June 30th. And you can learn more information at stewardshipnetwork/spring. A couple things to note. New this year is our reporting form accepts multiple categories in one entry. And another new feature this year is that you can directly upload your own files and formats if you desire. So that's a great option if you're already collecting a bunch of your data and you don't want to make individual submissions for your workdays. You can bulk upload them using the same form at stewardshipnetwork.org/spring. We brought back our TSN Spring Challenge boost this year. So they made a splash in 2023 and they are back in 2024. There are a lot of great prizes there for you all to enter in the drawing for. So we encourage you to do that. Submitting on a weekly basis gives you the best chance to win one of those prizes. So it all counts here, right? We count volunteer hours, which are a huge part and a historic part of our Spring Challenge every year. And we also count professional stewards. So if you're in the field and you are doing work that you're getting paid for, that still totally counts. Prescribed burns, removing invasive species, all of the above. We really encourage you to submit all of your hours, and whether it's volunteer or professional. So we set a really high bar last year. Over 50,000 total hours of stewardship were reported, with over 13,600 total participants, which is the highest we've ever had in a single year. Pretty incredible. That all translates to over 1.6 million in work hour value poured into our local ecosystems. And now for this year, we are off to a really great start. So 14,000 plus total hours of stewardship already reported. And these are numbers that we generally don't see until later in the year in the Spring Challenge. So we are really, really excited and hopeful for what our final tallies will be. And we have over 5,500 total participants. Remarkable. Each of those individual people getting out in the field and doing stewardship work or going out and doing outreach in their communities and overall just supporting the healthy local native ecosystems that we all cherish so much. And again, we ended April with late May numbers. So we're hopeful that we don't want to say we're getting ahead of ourselves. We want to keep up the momentum and keep doing those submissions. So we really appreciate everybody that has submitted already. And if you have not, there is still plenty of time. Now, I have to tell you that as somebody who does not generally plan too far into the future, that's just me personally, it is remarkable to me that this amazing initiative has come together after several years. Shout out to Bob Zamet, our communications director, for making this all happen. But for those that are not familiar with Zingerman's, some of the best sandwiches in Ann Arbor. I knew that before I even went to school in Ann Arbor. It was told to me from students before me. And they're a really wonderful organization that also has some great ways to support community or businesses in their community and nonprofits. And so we are really excited to be the nonprofit spotlight host, or the subjects of the nonprofit spotlight for May 2024. From Zingerman's, we're grateful to organizations like TSN who passionately lead the way for us and others in our community. It's also really exciting because Zingerman's has recently instituted some policies within their organization related to environmental, practices and sustainability. And so we're really happy for them, happy that they're leading the way in terms of being a great business, and really grateful for them sharing this spotlight with us. Now, I would love to introduce our guests for this month. So we have Katharine Hogan from Northern Illinois University, and the talk today will be Mice, Voles, Beetles, and Native Plants, a tour of their responses to management at Nachusa Grasslands, Illinois. With that, I will stop sharing my screen, and Katharine, you can take it away.
All right, thank you. Me. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for being here. My name is Katharine Hogan. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Evidence-Based Restoration Lab at Northern Illinois University in Northern Illinois, North Central Illinois. And today I'm going to be talking to you about small mammal communities, beetle communities, and plant communities, and kind of give you a tour of their responses to some of the main management activities going on at Nachusa Grasslands, Illinois. But first, just a really brief introduction about myself. I got bit with the restoration and conservation bug in 2009 when I got my first job doing wetland restoration in the northeastern hardwoods of Vermont, and did my bachelor's and master's in environmental science in Indiana before living the science and stewardship nomad life all over the western US, before coming back to Nebraska, falling in love with prairies, and eventually doing my PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln before coming here to Illinois for my postdoc. So, because I think we have a little bit of maybe a broader audience here today, I'm going to just take a couple minutes to talk a little bit about kind of prairies and their overall management and their history and the importance of their conservation today. So, the map that you see on the screen here is an estimated range of most of the known grasslands in the United States prior to European colonization. Today, we're obviously going to be talking about the tallgrass prairie, which extends eastward into Illinois. So before European colonization, Illinois was mostly prairie. Roughly 60% of the state, or approximately 22 million acres, were estimated to be tallgrass prairie. And today we have less than 1/100% of remnant unplowed prairie left in the state. So less than 2,000 acres in total. And I'm not going to take too long to try to convince you all of the importance and the promise of restoration and conservation, but Illinois is a really thriving state in terms of the community of really diverse folks with different missions all working together to preserve, restore, and conserve native tallgrass biodiversity. So just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Nachusa Grasslands, the preserve, and the current management activities that occur there. And then we're going to talk about two scientific studies that I've been a part of since starting my postdoc here at NIU. The first one is going to be looking at the impacts of management on small mammals and dung beetle communities at Nachusa. And then the second one is going to be about controlling an invasive shrub, bush honeysuckle, with herbicide, and then the impacts to the surrounding plant community, as well as the efficacy of that control effort in and of itself. So before I go any further, I do want to take a minute to give all credit where credit is due. I joined both of these projects after the field work. So after most of the hard work was already done, and then I took over the writing and the analysis and the publication process. But I just want to give a lot of credit to the folks that have started, conceived, and have been working on these projects for years, which includes my supervisor, Holly Jones, who's the rockstar PI of the Evidence-Based Restoration Lab at Northern Illinois University, Nick Barber, Kirsty Savage, Angela Burke-Peageden, Cheryl Hosler, and Aaron Roland Schaefer. And then for the honeysuckle and plant community study that we'll be talking about second, Caleb Baker. This research was originally his master's thesis, as well as Elizabeth Bach and Nick Barber. So a little bit of background about Nachusa Grasslands. It's in north central Illinois, and it's a preserve owned by the Nature Conservancy. It was founded almost 40 years ago, 1986, with a purchase of a couple hundred acres of remaining remnant unplowed prairie. It's since increased by over an order of magnitude. The preserve currently sits at a little under 3,700 acres of mostly prairie restorations, a couple remnants, and then a little bit of wetland, savanna, and woodland habitat. We're going to be focusing on prairie ecosystems for the first study, and then moving into the woodlands for the second study that we'll be talking about. And it's a huge hotspot for research and conservation. It's nationally recognized. There's researchers there from all over the country that come here to learn about tallgrass prairie biodiversity, conservation, ecosystem ecology, and all sorts of amazing topics. And it's also home to a fair number of threatened and endangered species, both plants and other taxa. I think the plant list for the preserve is something like well over 700 species, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know that the majority of native bee species that are found across the entire state of Illinois are also found just within the borders of the preserve. So it's a really amazing hotspot for remaining tallgrass prairie biodiversity. And it's just a beautiful place. So highly recommend, if you're ever in the area, go check it out. It's worth a visit. So, and again, because I think we maybe have a little bit more of a general audience today, I'm like to talk about some forces that have affected grasslands historically and also more currently. The first two that we'll be talking about in the first study are, of course, bison, or more generally, large ungulate grazing of grasslands. Grasslands, since the last ice age, have evolved with heavy pressure from grazing, as well as with fire. Some of that fire was lightning starts, just natural starts, but more consistently, indigenous peoples of the plains have been using fire for thousands of years to rejuvenate the plant community, rejuvenate the soil, and also attract the bison that then graze the grass that is stimulated by the fire. And then I'm not going to talk about this one yet because this is for the second study, but the third force affecting grasslands we'll be talking about today, unfortunately not a historical natural one, is that of invasive plants. So the bison herd at Nachusa, it currently sits at a little over 100 animals. It kind of varies depending on how many calves they get in a given year. And they were reintroduced to Nachusa in 2014, and their enclosure has since been expanded to roughly half of the preserve, with plans to make that even bigger and hopefully grow the herd a little bit more in the future. For the most part, they are not managed. They're free roaming within their enclosure 364 days out of the year, with the exception of 1 year when they have to be brought through for an annual roundup for some very basic vet checks, and then to give that year's calves their critical vaccinations. And then prescribed fire is the other main management tool that Nachusa uses a lot. Tallgrass prairies often need a fairly high fire return interval, 1 to 2 years at max, most 3 years. So about 60% of the preserve is burned annually. And most they usually are going to go about 3 years before burning it to kind of keep rejuvenating that community and removing the dead plant material. So why is it important to study these two together? So fire and large ungulate grazing work together to kind of maximize diversity, because fire tends to very, very strongly stimulate grass growth. So your really common, really abundant, your really big grasses like your big bluestem, your Indian grass, your switchgrass, and other species. The bison, in turn, they do graze on some forbs, they do eat some wildflowers, but most of their diet is going to be grasses. It's going to be C4 and C3 warm season and cool season grasses. So they then diminish the vigor and the size and the stature of those grasses. And when you apply those two things over a landscape, you get this really wonderful heterogeneous variable mosaic of different kinds of habitats. Some have more grass, some have less grass. You have a lot of variation in the structure in terms of you have some areas that are cropped short by the bison, other areas are taller, and that overall tends to preserve more biodiversity than just using one or the other or neither. And this is just kind of a visual example of what that can look like. And you'll see in my very neatly and elegantly drawn red circle there, in the background is one of the grazing exclosures at Nachusa Grasslands. So it's burned whenever the rest of the unit is burned, but the bison can't access it. They can't graze it. And if you compare it to the foreground, you'll see that there's a lot of really tall grass there. It looks like there's comparatively fewer flowers there, as opposed to in the foreground where you've got more flowers, the grasses are mowed a lot shorter, and you have a lot more of that kind of variation in height that helps support a bigger diversity of different species. So what does this mean for what I like to call the unsung heroes of prairie restorations? Understandably, because plants are what we can most directly influence, most of our science tends to focus on the plant communities, as does our management. Plants don't run away when you go to burn them or when you go to graze them. But if we're interested in long-term conservation and successful conservation, we also do have to be thinking about the other taxa who occupy very important positions within the prairie web and could potentially have larger impacts on the overall health of the prairie in the long term. So in the case of small mammals occupy a really central part of prairie food webs, especially at Nachusa. There's not that many small mammal species that you're going to find on any given site. For the study that we're going to be talking about today, the overall species richness of small mammals, which is I think 400 grams and under, is only about 4 species. So there's not that many, but they're very, very abundant. So if you have a form of management that is either negatively or positively impacting any one species, that possibly has far-reaching effects for the rest of the ecosystem. Partly because they eat just about everything they can fit in their mouths. They're going to eat normal regular, like leafy plant material. They're going to eat seeds. They're going to eat every form of invertebrate that they can get their mouths on. And then they pass that energy up to the higher trophic levels. So if you care about the birds of prey that come to your preserve, they're going to be relying on the small mammals. Same with the mesopredators, mesocarnivores, as well as some like snakes, reptiles, and even some amphibians to a lesser degree. So dung beetles are kind of jack of all trades within prairies. They fulfill a lot of really critical ecosystem functions. The first is probably kind of obvious. They're decomposers. They mostly like to feed on dung, but more generally just dead organic material. So they are really important drivers of nutrient cycling and putting organic material back into the prairie soil. Also, just the physical act of them digging through the soil tends to aerate the soil. It tends to break up any compaction issues you may have. They're also actually a really good form of pest management. They're included in some integrative pest management strategies as a way to control certain flies, horn flies that tend to pester cattle during the hot months. So I don't think anyone has studied this directly, but it's possible that having a good, healthy dung beetle community on your prairies may have benefits for the bison by way of controlling some of those flies that bother the bison during the hot months. And then finally, because they do feed on just general organic matter, they do also fulfill a seed dispersal role as well. So our general question that we asked with this study was just, how does management impact these taxa? They're both understudied. But because we're ecologists and we had to make things a lot more complex for ourselves, we specifically worded it as how do management-driven changes in community composition of small mammals and dung beetles impact the ecosystem function of those communities? And when I say ecosystem function, I mean, rather than just looking at the numbers or the abundance or the composition of these communities, we chose a characteristic that each of those communities possesses, which has a direct link to those ecological functions that they fulfill that I just talked about in the last couple slides. So in the case of small mammals, we decided to look at field metabolic rate, which is basically an estimation of how much caloric energy they are throughputting through the community. And then beetles, they're just the size of the beetle has been correlated to different ecological functions that they fulfill. So we chose to look at biomass, or just how much the individuals individually and collectively weighed. So here's a slightly different version of the map of Nachusa that we just looked at. It has the locations of the trapping grids that we used for this study, as well as a bunch of studies that have been going on in Nachusa for quite a while. For this study, we selected 13 different prairie restorations of various ages, some younger, some more mature. And then within those 13 prairie restorations, there's 18 research grids from which researchers have, as I said, been collecting data from for over a decade at this point. Each research grid is a 60 by 60 meter grid with 25 sampling points arranged in a grid across that area. And those points are used for either trapping or collecting plant data or any other variables of interest. So for this study, we broke our treatments down into no bison, so sites that had not had bison reintroduced to them, which are the green areas on the map, versus bison sites, which are the brown, this is the brown area of the map, and that's where bison have been reintroduced. And then we also split sites into either burned or unburned, and we considered burned to be if there had been a prescribed fire on that site within the previous dormant season, because again, these sites do tend to have a very high fire return interval. And then we're looking at 5 years of small mammal data for this study. They were live trapped using Sherman traps from 2015 to 2019. And then the dung beetles were trapped from 2017 to 2018 using pitfall traps. And then the second question that we wanted to ask, and I promise there's not going to be any math in this presentation at all. There's one kind of new and unique kind of plot that we're all going to be walking through in terms of how to visualize data, but there's not going to be any math, I promise. So our second question was, how can we use an innovative quantitative tool to complement the lessons that we learn from more traditional statistical methods like linear regression modeling? That approach is called the CAFE approach, or community assembly and the functioning of ecosystems approach. And what that does is it uses some basically pretty clever arithmetic to look at a pre-disturbance community, which in our case is unburned or sites with no bison, and a post-disturbance community, which in our case is either a burned site or a site with bison. And it then breaks down the contributions of species that are either gained between the communities, species that are lost between communities, and then species that are present in both the pre and post-disturbance communities, but changed in abundance. And then it looks at, for each one of those categories, how much are each of those categories contributing to the overall ecosystem function that we're seeing on these sites. So this is the type of plot that's used to talk about this. And let me see. So they're always going to look like this. They're always going to have species richness on the x-axis, and then your response that we're interested in is going to be ecosystem function, which again, in our case is field metabolic rate and biomass. And the stars represent just kind of an example of what a traditional statistical method might look at. It would say, okay, here is the mean ecosystem function of our pre-disturbance community, and here's the mean ecosystem function of the post-disturbance community. And then we would use statistical tests to see, is it significantly greater, is it significantly less, or is it statistically the same between the pre and the post-disturbance? But what the CAFE method lets us do is, if you think back to those three categories of species lost, species gained, and species in both, it takes us on this little three-step walk. So the first step is going to be, how many species did we lose? And how much function did those species contribute that we lost? So in this case, it would say, okay, when we moved from the pre-disturbance to the post-disturbance, we lost about 2 species and about 5 units of ecosystem function. However, we also gained a different species that also contributed some ecosystem function. And then the species that are in both communities actually increased the amount of function that they were contributing. So that could mean they either increased in abundance or they individually increased in the amount of function that they were contributing. All right, that's the hard part. So after prescribed fire in these sites, we found that there was a slight increase, statistically insignificant, in the amount of energy transferred that small mammal communities contributed to this community. And when I use the term significantly or insignificantly on this slide and the next slide, I'm referring to the complementary statistical models that we did. I'm not going to dive into those models too in depth because I want to focus on the more unique results that this approach offers, but we did do a complementary statistical model to kind of help us figure out what the statistical significance of these kind of quantitative patterns that we were seeing were. So in this case, there was a small increase in energy transfer from small mammals. And if you'll see, I think you guys can see my mouse here, the purple vector here that points up is responsible for most of that change. So what that says to us is there was a species, probably potentially a really common species like deer mouse, that was present in both burned and unburned communities that contributed a little bit more to ecosystem function. So it's through putting a little bit more caloric energy through the function in the burned sites versus the unburned sites. So then the dung beetle biomass kind of behaved similarly after prescribed fire. There was a slight but statistically significant increase in the amount of biomass. So in terms of, that's either how much the individual beetles weighed, but probably more likely a change in their abundance. They became slightly more, but not statistically significantly more common in the burn sites. And you can't even really see the beginning of the arrow of that little 3-step path there, but that fat blue arrow on the left is pointing to it. So we actually did gain a species relative in the post-disturbance community and a little bit of function, but again, not statistically significant in terms of the amount of function contributed. So after bison reintroduction, kind of similar, a little bit mostly similar result for the small mammals. We had an insignificant decrease this time, in the sense that the small mammal community was contributing a little bit less energy throughput in the sites with bison as opposed to the sites without bison. But then, this is probably not going to surprise any of you, the biomass contributed by dung beetles before and after bison reintroduction was 200% greater in the sites with bison. And if we were looking at just the stats models that we ran on these ecological function variables, this was the only statistically significant main effect in terms of a big change that happened to these communities after these management methods of fire and bison grazing. So this is where we can really get into what's, for me, one of the most interesting parts about this method is now that we have this kind of three-step snapshot of the change that's happening in these communities because of these management activities, we can start to think and apply our natural history knowledge of the site to, okay, maybe what species in particular are responding to this. And in this case, if I was going to be investigating these communities further, I would look at the patterns of this one species in particular. So the scooped scarab is by far the most dominant species that you find at Nachusa Grasslands in terms of the dung beetle communities. It was 84% of all of the individuals trapped over those 2 years. So it's extremely dominant within the community. And I would guess if you were to look into the individual species by species patterns, most of the increase in function that we saw as a result of reintroducing bison would be this one species, the scoop scarab, probably increasing drastically in terms of abundance. And then the only other result that the model told us that we couldn't really assess with the cafe approach was the interaction. And the only statistically significant result from an interaction effect was that dung beetles do the best in sites that have both bison and fire. However, they tend to do comparatively the worst in sites that have bison, but no fire. So the dung beetles are then an example of a taxa that really benefits from having both of those management techniques used simultaneously on the prairie. So some overall conclusions from this first study that we made. Overall, small mammals were fairly resilient to disturbance-based management. We didn't see that much of a change in their community in terms of losing particular species or particular elements of the community. If I had to guess, we were seeing a little bit of community turnover. So if you'll remember those vectors that show that we lost a species, but then we gained a species. And if I had to hypothesize, I would suggest that we might want to look at the prairie vole specifically, which is a prairie specialist that needs a really heavy, thick thatch cover. They don't tend to do as well with disturbance-based management. So this kind of combination of techniques can kind of give us ways to pursue possible more pointed studies on specific species, or kind of see in a little bit more nuanced way how our management activities are impacting these communities. And unsurprisingly, dung beetles, they increased in both species richness and ecological function following bison reintroduction, especially. And again, this paper was not at all about criticizing traditional statistical methods. It was more about exploring how using these complementary methods can give us some more nuanced and useful information about all of those very intricate interspecies dynamics that we can see within different taxa and within different communities following these very heterogeneous variables like prescribed fire and bison grazing. So if anyone wants to nerd out and read more on this study, it was published last September in the journal Ecology. It's open access, it's not paywalled, it's free for anyone to read and download. So if you want to look that up, that is also available, and it goes more in depth into all the analyses and the methods that we did. So now we're going to pivot a little bit from bison and fire to talking specifically about the impact of invasive plants on grasslands and Nachusans in particular. So study number 2, again, is going to be talking about controlling bush honeysuckle and how it impacts the surrounding community. So probably most of you are familiar with this disreputable character, the honeysuckle. There's several problematic species within the genus of Lonicera that have really become a problem, mostly across the eastern Canada and US, but into the Midwest, and they're even starting to edge into the Great Plains somewhat at this point. Particularly today, we're going to be talking about the bush honeysuckle or Lonicera macchii. Bush honeysuckle, as well as other honeysuckle species, have a lot of characteristics that make them really tough customers to deal with from the land management perspective. They're allelopathic. They change the soil chemistry to favor their own growth over the growth of surrounding species. They tend to leaf out very early in the season, so they tend to shade out a lot of the native plants, especially our very delicate spring ephemerals that we see. And they have multiple other invasive traits. Any individual honeysuckle bush can produce hundreds or thousands of seeds, and they tend to be dispersed very far by birds and other animals. And then there's also been some documented impacts on additional taxa, like they tend to increase nest predation of songbirds that try to use honeysuckle as nesting sites. So managers deal with these in a bunch of different ways. So one of them is prescribed fire. There's kind of varying evidence as to how well it consistently kills honeysuckle. Mechanical clearing is a very thorough way to get rid of honeysuckle, but it obviously can be very, very destructive if you're using heavy machinery to the surrounding plant community. And it also can be very expensive and time intensive. And same thing with hand cutting or pulling. This is probably the best option for small areas or if you have really, really delicate plants. But again, hand cutting and hand pulling can take a long time to clear large areas. And then cutting an herbicide together, that's probably the best way to both remove honeysuckle effectively and have them not come back. But again, it's very time intensive, so it's very hard to manage landscapes kind of at scale using just this method. And then also, of course, comparing different herbicide treatments. So just figuring out which herbicides kill it the most effectively. What we understand less are some more specific elements within this regime of current treatments. We don't really know how treatment seasonality affects the mortality of honeysuckle when they're treated with basal bark herbicide. And our thought for this study was we wanted to investigate if land managers can go out at any time of the year and treat honeysuckle, or if they need to go out at a specific time. So obviously, managers during the summer are extremely strapped for time, and there's 10,000 things to do. And we are looking to see if managers could instead, make during the winter when things are slower and there's a little bit more available time, go out and treat these shrubs just as effectively as during the growing season. And then also, no, we couldn't find any evidence that anyone had looked at how herbicide interacts with prescribed fire. So does burning a site and using herbicide, using two methods together, does that increase the effectiveness of these treatments? And then third, surrounding community impacts. Nobody's really looked at very deeply at how they impact the immediately surrounding plants. So our objective number one, this is kind of just going to be a repeat of what I just said, but our first objective was to determine the optimal timing of trichopyr basal bark application to maximize honeysuckle mortality. These treatments took place from fall 2017 to spring 2018. We did 4 different treatments. So we herbicided some plants in November and December 2017, then winter in late January, early spring, second week of March, and then later in the spring, first week of April. And we compared all of these to an untreated control. And then our second objective was to determine if mortality varies with prescribed fire or interacts with any of those seasonal herbicide treatments. So those prescribed fires happened spring 2018, and we compared them to an unburned control. And then objective 3, which I'll mostly skip over until we get to there, was to measure the negative effects on non-target plant communities. So here's your third map of Nachusa for the day, a slightly different map. This study was very collaborative. There were multiple landowners that were involved in this. 2 of the sites that we used for 5 sites total were there were 2 at Nachusa, 2 on Franklin Creek State Natural Area, which is owned by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And then the 5th and final site was located on an adjacent private landowner's property. And then from there, we split each of those 5 sites into a burned and an unburned plot for a total of 10 plots, 5 burned and 5 not burned. And then throughout the course of the study, we were tracking the fate of individually tagged honeysuckle. So we were not doing sort of broad percent cover within plot-based metrics. We were actually tagging and tracking 800 individual honeysuckle throughout this species or throughout this study. So I'm going to go a little bit more into the details of this than I ordinarily would, just because I suspect there's some folks here that are probably really interested in it. But I would also encourage anyone who wants to know more about the actual details of the treatment to check out the Grassland Restoration Network blog. Caleb, who this study was his thesis, he just published a fantastic blog post on the Grassland Restoration Network blog, kind of that goes more into detail with kind of how he did these treatments and how he did the study. So it was 2.5 gallons of Garland 4 Ultra to 12.5 gallons of basal bark oil as the carrier for a volume equivalent, 16.67% equivalent to 10% triclopyr ester. And this was applied with a basal bark backpack sprayer. So it's something that one individual can do, or a crew of however many backpack sprayers you've got. With a nozzle pointed directly downwards, mostly, not horizontally. And he was looking to get full coverage of all of the stems of the honeysuckle of about a 6 to 12-inch band. And then using moderate pressure with a narrow cone pattern, just to kind of try to minimize the runoff from the shrub onto the ground beneath the base of the shrub. And then this will be important to talk about on the next slide. They checked mortality twice, a week after application, and then some months later that fall. And what we found is triclopyr is very effective at killing honeysuckle. We had 2.5% mortality in our control group, possibly due to the prescribed burns we had. Our least effective treatment was the late spring treatment. They were all statistically the same, by the way, but the least effective treatment was 96.7% mortality. The overall treatment was treatment effectiveness was 98.4. I think the winter and the early spring treatments were tied for most effective at like 99.5% mortality. But the key thing is this process did take time. So when we went and checked the mortality a week after application, the initial apparent mortality was only 25%. So it did take months for the herbicide to eventually exhaust the reserves of these plants and essentially kill them. On the other hand, prescribed fire didn't do anything for the effectiveness of these treatments. The mortality in the burned versus unburned overall was essentially the same and statistically the same. And there also wasn't an interaction between the herbicide and burning. So burning did not make any particular herbicide treatment any more or less effective. It just didn't really impact it at all. And then we also included in our model site-specific factors in case, some sites are maybe a little bit wetter or drier. Some sites have different topography, different factors like that could impact the effectiveness of these treatments. And we found that they didn't really contribute any explanatory power to the model. So site-specific factors weren't really coming into play here. We did also initially look at several other variables that we eventually pulled from the final analysis because they didn't impact mortality at all. Honeysuckle height didn't impact mortality. I have heard anecdotal evidence that taller and larger honeysuckles do take longer to die, but the end mortality rates were the same no matter how tall the honeysuckle was. Same with the basal collar width, so the width of just the base of where it meets the ground, that didn't impact mortality, and the number of stems didn't impact mortality at all. All right, so objective number 3, or what we call the ring of death objective. So we started noticing after treating these honeysuckle that there was a ring of about maybe a little less than a foot across of dead plants that had basically essentially all died after the basal bark treatment. So we wanted to look at that a little bit more in depth and see what these potential negative effects were on the non-target plant community, and ideally, get an idea of, are they recovering over time, or is it just a permanent result of the herbicide? So for this longer term part of the study, we selected 80 shrubs across 4 of the plots. We weren't able to really include burn treatments in the study after this point because after the initial treatments in spring of 2018, normal management resumed and there wasn't really any prescribed fire differentiation between the plots. But we looked at the communities for 4 years total, in usually late May or early June from 2018 to 2021, and collected data on percent living cover per species within a 1 square meter quadrat around the honeysuckle. And the honeysuckle here is basically disintegrated, but it's right where that stake was put in to mark where the center of the plot should be. So what we found is there was a slight reduction in species richness of about 1.5 to 2 species between the control and the treatments. So on this plot, the orange is the native species richness, and the blue is non-native species richness. So the early spring richness was not significantly lower. That was the one exception. It was statistically the same species richness as the control plots. The overall native species richness across all the plots was a little bit more than 8 species, and the average non-native species richness was about 1.8 species, give or take a little. And what we really wanted to look at with this model is, okay, once we do these treatments, are we seeing an influx of new non-native, or for that matter, native species over time? And we didn't really see that. We didn't really see any interactions of native species richness increasing with time, or non-native species richness increasing with time. And we also did look specifically at spring ephemerals, because those are some of the most delicate members of the community that are most likely to be affected potentially by this kind of treatment, and they were not disproportionately impacted more or less than the rest of the plant community. So for percent cover, it was lower in some treatments, but overall we did see increases across treatments. So the amount of each plant per plot did increase by 4 years after treatment. The early spring and the late spring were slightly less affected in terms of percent cover than the fall and the winter treatments, but you're kind of splitting hairs at that point. They were all fairly similar in terms of how the percent cover of native plants responded following this treatment. But the thing I would like to point out here is that while these treatments did take a little bit of a hit in terms of their native plant cover, they continued to increase and increase by the 2021, and the percent cover of species and control plots continued to decline. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there in the sense that you are potentially going to lose a species or two in species richness if you choose to do this method, but the trade-off is that those control plots are going to continue to decline. So if you don't treat them, things are just going to get worse, essentially. So final thoughts and applications from this. Our biggest non-native offender post-treatment in terms of percent cover was garlic mustard. It was pretty prevalent in the plots beforehand. We did see a slight increase in how abundant it was following the treatment. So that would be potentially a species to watch if you know you have it in the area. And then likewise, Virginia creeper also responded very, very strongly. This was our strongest response in terms of it increased in cover following these herbicide treatments. So our conclusion from this paper was that you guys can effectively go out and treat honeysuckle regardless of seasonality, at least from fall through spring, using this method, and is probably going to have pretty similar effectiveness. So you can go out during the winter when you're going stir crazy and you don't have anything to do, or you can go out in the spring. It's not going to matter. And this is not to say that basal bark treatment is a silver bullet. There's no silver bullets in conservation, but we did want to show that basal bark treatment is a really useful additional tool in invasive species management for folks depending on the context. And potentially this technique might be particularly useful in heavily invaded mid or low grade woodlands, which is what our study sites were for the study. There wasn't anything particularly really high value in terms of the plant communities, but they weren't completely degraded either. And then basal bark, the good thing about basal bark is that it's very quick and it's very effective. It doesn't take much time. It's very fast because you're not removing any of the biomass. And it's especially good if you're going to have to go out and do repeat treatments to continue to kill honeysuckle that are like newly recruited from the seed bank. So that's all I have for that second study. If you want more information on this study, you can either, or any of the studies, you can contact me. If you want more information about like the field work or the details of the application side of this study, feel free to contact Caleb Baker at caleb.baker@illinois.gov. Or, like I said, definitely check out his blog post that was published on April 25th, just the other week on this study. And we don't have the publication out for this yet. It has been accepted at Ecological Solutions and Evidence and will be published open access, free to read and download and save sometime in the near future. So with that, thank you all, and I can take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. Really appreciate the overview of both of those studies, and I want to remind folks to share their questions using the Q&A function in the utilizing Zoom. So I have just a couple thoughts to kick us off here as I'm reviewing my notes. So I guess one higher level question I was curious about is how does your work with bison connect with or exist within the context of other work with bison across the US? Because I'm really intrigued by, the history of bison in, across the United States. And if you're aware of other groups that are doing bison work or if you're connecting with them about your insights. So do you know anything about that or how you connect with others working on bison?
A little bit, yeah. So one of the key things, the Nachusa herd is, I think, the biggest herd east of the Mississippi River. There are some bison at, I think it's Kankakee Sands at another TNC preserve. And then there's other herds also at in the Lost Hills in Iowa, in Nebraska, and as well as other states. So there's a lot of larger conservation herds now. In terms of working together, because the Nachusa herd is still on the smaller side, it's only a little bit over 100 animals. Every year at that annual roundup, they actually do trade several, I think it's usually about half a dozen mature, or maybe it's calves, I can't remember, but they trade about half a dozen individuals from the herd with other conservation herds to try to prevent inbreeding depression over time and try to preserve the genetic diversity among these conservation herds. So that's probably the main one that they do. They've also started up some really great partnerships with the Menominee tribe in Wisconsin, trying to restore bison to those ancestral lands and basically giving the tribe bison for management and for their own food sovereignty. In terms of other research, I'm a little less familiar with just like all the different studies that have been done on bison. I know that the Nachusa herd is probably one of the most intensely studied, but there is quite a bit of other research going on across the country in terms of even just trying to understand basic things about like what are they eating? Because there was a lot of um, kind of conversation going back and forth like, do they eat forbs? Do they not? Do they just eat grass? Do they not? And there was a really cool study that came out of the Nachusa herd by Holly Jones and some other collaborators a few years ago that kind of was able to break it down and say they're eating about, averaged over the course of the year, they're eating about 70% graminoids, so C4 and C3 grasses, and about 30% forbs, at least at this herd. That might not be the same for other herds because, again, they're going to adapt to the local conditions where they are. But that's an example of like some really cool research that's come out that's giving us a lot of really interesting information about the natural history of the species.
Hmm. That's awesome. Very cool. Quick question from Bob Kellum wondering, how do you manage the bison, or do you know how they manage the bison with the fire? So did they have to be moved, or did they kind of naturally avoid it, or how did that work when you were doing bison and fire in the same sites?
They naturally avoid it. They're pretty evolutionarily ingrained that they're if they see smoke, they're gonna move in the other direction. I don't know for sure if there have been any issues in the past with like stragglers because sometimes the big bulls will break off from the herd and they'll just go hang out on the prairie by themselves. And those are the ones that are usually kind of lagging behind the rest of the herd. I don't know for certain if there have been instances where like they've just had to call off a burn because a bison wouldn't move. It wouldn't surprise me if that's happened, but I think for the most part, when they detect fire in the area, they're going to kind of mosey off to another area. And they're going to be burning unit by unit. So they're not going to be burning like the entire bison pasture with a single burn. They're just going to burn it piece by piece, basically.
Mhm, mhm. Yep, that makes sense. So I have a bit of a high level question in helping me understand the cafe approach, which I found really interesting, and maybe other folks will wonder the same thing. So, if I'm understanding correctly, the cafe approach, you were describing it as qualitative somewhat rather than quantitative. Is that right? Or it's kind of a
It's quantitative, not
okay, okay.
it's not a statistical approach. So
That is
it's
okay. That's the distinction. Got it. Okay.
Yeah, it is. It's looking at the number of species and the function contributed by those species. So that's the two kind of quantitative pieces of information that it takes. And then it basically calculates what is the average function contributed by species. And then it kind of plots out these different vectors for how much function is lost per species, how many species are lost, and then it kind of coalesces it into those three plots, those three like arrows that you see. Believe it or
Hmm.
not, that's the simplified version of the analysis. The full analysis actually has five vectors.
Yeah.
But that's like we would have been here all day if I tried to talk about that.
Uh-huh.
So you
Uh-huh.
can pretty easily consolidate it down to those three and get an idea like, okay, we lost a couple species, but we didn't lose any function, which would mean that the ones that you lost were overall kind of contributing average function. It means they weren't contributing a ton of function and they weren't contributing less function than normal.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that's so it's kind of a consolidation of basically 5 arithmetic equations that make up each vector, and then it just combines it into one snapshot of how the community changes when you introduce some kind of disturbance.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, thank you so much, because I may have misheard originally, but that makes a lot of sense, because it certainly is a simplified but still kind of like numerically based, and that's interesting to think about how that compares. Like you said, the insights that you can get by combining the statistical and the cafe approach. It's very additive, it seems. So that's great. Um, okay, and then so I wanted to ask you, in terms of, so you talked about invasives in the second study, right? And in the first study, invasives was not as much of a focus, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so I was curious, because the use of the word disturbance is also very interesting to me. And from a technical sense, it totally makes sense, right? A disturbance being bison or disturbance being fire. I often think of disturbance as something like development, right? Or something other like man-made thing. But of course, there are disturbances in the natural world as well. Um, but so this is either, if you know anything about this, or maybe this is a question for like future studies or something. But I'm very curious, because seeing that some invasive species rebounded quickly post herbicide disturbance makes me wonder if there might be like, have there been issues with invasive species rebounding after bison or fire, right? Because I'm wondering if the bison, for example, if they're grazing indiscriminately, then maybe they're eating the invasive species too, so it's not a big deal. But if they're being more specific in what they eat, they could maybe prioritize things that are not invasive species. So I guess I'm just curious in general if you know of anything about that, or if that's a future direction for research, perhaps.
Yeah, there's so yeah, I think like 3 things popped into my head at once, so I'm trying to think of how to kind of combine them all. So Erin Roland Schaefer, she was part of the small mammal study. She was the PhD student who's been managing that study for the last 5 years. She looked at kind of a similar, different question, but some of the conclusions she came to are similar enough that I'm going to kind of crib off her research to answer it. She basically found that in terms of the plant communities, there tends to be bigger problems with non-native species, at least in the prairies, the closer you are to human development. So whether it's a road, whether building, or closer to a town, like there's a housing development just on the north side of the preserve. And then in terms of what the bison are eating, I can't answer the question as to are they eating more native versus non-native. I would guess, if I had to just kind of hypothesize, I would guess they're probably prioritizing the species that they're evolutionarily developed to target, but that may include really similar species like some of the non-native legumes that we have at Nachusa. So those are currently the biggest invasive issue that they're dealing with on the prairie. They burn enough that they don't, on the prairie, they don't have issues really with shrub invasion, not in a large way, but where they're running into difficulties is with a couple specific perennial legumes. So bird's foot trefoil is the one that they're currently really like fighting tooth and nail.
Hmm.
And I think that one, it was one of those species that's potentially more related or is more often found in areas of the preserve that are closer to disturbance. So
Hmm.
overall, I guess I could say that I would suspect that the patterns of invasive species on the preserve are more likely being driven by human factors rather than bison, but
Hmm.
that hasn't been studied explicitly, so I can't answer it any more specifically.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to run through just a few more. We've got some great questions in the chat. So thank you, or sorry, in the Q&A. Thank you so much, everybody. One attendee asks, what is the range in size of the bison enclosures, and how might that size be determined?
So the size of the enclosure, so let me see. The whole preserve is currently about 3,700 acres. I believe the bison enclosure is 1,800 acres currently. So it's about half of the preserve, and they are planning to expand it to more of the preserve.
Mhm.
But it's currently right at about half of the preserve in a single unit, kind of in the main portion of the preserve.
Got it. Great, great. So then Chris asks, I may have missed this, but did the team go back and look at the herbicide treated honeysuckle plants the following year?
So I didn't talk about that, but yes, they did. So, and the reason I didn't talk about it is because nothing changed. So after that initial kind of slow die off that took like 6 months to really kind of kick in, they did go back in 2019 and they resurveyed all of the honeysuckle, and there were a total of, I'm trying to think back, I think there were literally two honeysuckle that were in a control that switched from dead to damaged, in terms of they had a couple leaves, but they were still looking pretty rough. So that's 2 out of 640.
Mhm, mhm.
So yeah.
Great. So then another question for your study: did you try any basal bark or cut stump treatments during the summer?
No, we did not. No, we just focused on the dormant season and then early spring and late spring.
Mhm. Great, thank you. And I think this is the last one here for now. Do you think conservation-oriented cattle grazing in lieu of bison would have similar positive impacts on dung beetle communities?
Ooh, that's potentially a big can of worms question.
Mhm,
I'm guessing it would have some impact, just because you're simply returning a bunch of huge pooping animals to their habitat. I would guess that would have some sort of positive impact,
yeah, yeah.
but it hasn't been looked at specifically.
Mhm,
In terms of kind of like how cows act similar to bison, there's a lot of similarities and there's some differences, mainly in terms of where they choose to spend their time.
mhm,
Like bison tend to avoid certain areas. They don't stand in the water like cows do. But in terms of kind of like what they eat, there's a lot of similarities. So my guess would be that there is some positive impact of using conservation cattle grazing, but in terms of whether or not it would match the bison, I don't know. I can't answer that question.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, interesting to think about for sure. Well, again, thank you so much, Catherine. Really appreciate it. We had a lot of great engagement in the chat, and I really enjoyed the presentation. So, with that, I am going to just get our outro slides going here. All right. So we encourage everybody on this presentation to become a regular. So every second Wednesday in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, we will be doing monthly webcasts, and you can register in advance for these webcasts and get some reminder emails from us. So we'll go through a couple great upcoming webcasts for you. We have Minnesota Million Reforestation for Carbon Sequestration with Julie Ederson from the University of Minnesota Duluth. In July, we have Growing Towards Equitable Urban Forest Stewardship with Christine Carmichael from Fair Forests Consulting. And in August, we have Stewardship is Climate Action with Denise Keeley with Michigan Climate Action Network, one of our cherished partners at the Stewardship Network. So we encourage you to register for those in advance once again, and you will get reminder emails from us when they are coming up. And of course, got to talk about Spring Challenge once again. Encourage you to get your data in promptly, and you can be first in line for those boosts. So the more that you submit on a weekly basis, the more chances you have to win those boost prizes. So we really encourage you to do that. Please keep sharing your stories and photos with us. We've gotten so many great ones, and it really does add this layer of human excitement and connection to the work that we're doing. We all care about the numbers and the impact. That's really important, but the stories and the photos that you share with us are really, really important to us and really wonderful to share with our network. So please keep doing that. And check the site for easy ways to help us spread the word. We have all kinds of different information at stewardshipnetwork.org/spring. And if you ever would like, you're thinking about doing outreach with your community, or you're trying to figure out the best way to engage with your partners on the Spring Challenge, feel free to drop us a line. We would love to help you. It's really important to us to get the word out, and we could not do it without you. And with that, I will just say thank you so much again, Catherine. Thank you to Bob in the background for all of your help. And thank you to everybody that attended today. We will see you again next month. Take care.